I spoke with Yeonmi Park about 3 weeks ago, and she wrote In Order to Live. Now, she wrote In Order to Live, well, because she had a horrendous life. That's one reason. Even though one of the things she told me while I interviewed her was that she'd met people whose life was so much worse than hers that she felt blessed, which was quite the bloody catastrophe of a statement, I'll tell you. And anyways, her book ends in 2015. So I asked her what she had been doing since 2015. And she went to Columbia to take a humanities degree.
I talked to her about this recently too.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
No, but go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, she told me, she said, I mean, I thought that was quite remarkable. He had this young woman who was raised under the most horrifying totalitarian conditions. Well, not the most, because that's a deep hellhole, but bad enough. And then was a slave in China along with her mother. And then, managed to get to South Korea and then did all her pre-university education basically in 1 year, virtually hospitalized herself with effort. And during that time, she read Animal Farm by George Orwell, and that sort of motivated her to write. And then she went to university in South Korea, which is no joke. It's a very competitive place. And then she went to Columbia to take a humanities degree, which in her words was part of her father's wish that she become educated. And so she went to this stellar institution in the center of what's arguably the greatest city on earth to pursue the sort of enlightenment, to pursue the spark that had been lit in her by Orwell, let's say, and by her introduction to freedom. And I said, well, how was it at Columbia? And she said, it was a complete waste of time and money. And she's a reasonable person. She's not actually prone to statements like that. It quite surprised me. And I said, surely that can't be the case. I mean, that's a damning global statement. You must have had one professor, one course that spoke to you. And she said, well, there was a human biology course where I studied evolution, but even it got politically correct by the end. And I felt that I was never able to say anything I actually thought. And I pushed her, and she was adamant it was a catastrophe going to Columbia, and that she felt, I hope I'm not exaggerating this, but I do believe that this is what she was attempting to put forward. She didn't feel any freer in her speech and actions at Columbia than she did in bloody North Korea. And I wasn't dancing with glee hearing that, noting that my prognostications about political correctness in universities had manifested themselves. It's terribly shocking to me and terribly saddening that that's actually the case. And I've interviewed some older people recently, they'd be my age, who look back on their humanities education with nothing but nostalgia and the fondest of memories for the professors that opened up their lives and started them on their careers. Great journalists in Canada and businessmen as well. Jocko Willink as well, who took an English literature degree and was illuminated by it. What was it like for you at Columbia?
Jordan, it was a mix. On the one hand, Columbia has, and who knows how much longer this will be around, but it has what's called the core curriculum. It's basically a study of the classics. Freshman year, you read classical literature. Sophomore year, you study classical philosophy. That was the reason that I went to Columbia, and those classes for me were exactly what you described, that spark that Yeonmi felt when she read George Orwell. I absolutely.
And why were they that for you?
Well, first of all, I had never read those books before, and knew who Plato was vaguely, knew who Socrates was, knew. Go down the line, had heard who Virginia Woolf was. All of these books, they were soul expanding. And it happened to be that I got extremely lucky, especially in that second year course that I described, the philosophy course, to have a teacher who was genuinely committed to, I think, what education's supposed to be about at its best.
And what is it supposed to be about at its best, as far as you're concerned? What did it do for you?
Teaching me how to think and think critically and read a text and allow it at the deepest moments, have it transform me, rather than what I encountered, for example, in the Middle East Studies department, which was more like hearing a preacher. It was more just propaganda.
And what do you think the difference is between propaganda and education? I mean, especially, I'm asking you this because one of the claims that is splitting our culture down the middle is that there is nothing but propaganda, essentially. And you just think the propaganda on your side is the truth because it serves your purposes to believe that. So it's very, very important to make a distinction between propaganda and education. Now, you had two different kinds of classes as far as you're concerned. One of them you describe as opening yourself up, and the other you describe as being preached at. Okay, so what's the difference there?
Well, didn't I just describe the difference?
Well, I not so much on the preaching side. What were you being compelled to think in the Middle East? Okay, first of all, you're making a case that you were compelled to think in one set of classes. What were you compelled to think?
Well, let me give you an example. The course that I was thinking about in my mind as I just described this was a course called, Topics in Middle East Studies. So it's the entire region of the Middle East for going back thousands of years in a sort of general 101 course. It was part of a requirement if you wanted to to continue on in the major. And that course basically, here's what you had to accept, that the sole sort of source of maladies in what I think we all can agree is a very complicated and blood-soaked region of the world are all the result of essentially European or American colonialism, that everything goes back to that core idea, and that even things like, let's say in India, widow burning could be connected to colonialism. Even things like honor killing could be connected to colonialism. Everything had to do with this sort of one lens with which you could understand an extremely complicated thing. And then the second part, and this is again, like, I think oftentimes this is the case. If you know something about one particular topic, like let's say a lot about it, and you don't know a lot about Saudi Arabia or Iran or any of the other places you're studying, but you know a lot about this one place. And for me, that was Israel. And you hear that what you're being taught about it is so out of line with reality, then you start being skeptical about everything else the person is saying. And that was very much the case with me, that, first of all, Israel's one of, dozens of countries in the Middle East, but it was obsessed on in the course. And the one text we were asked to read about this complicated, very interesting place with a history that goes back thousands of years, which is the cradle of Western civilization, was a book by a guy called Maxime Rodinson. I recommend people look it up, called Israel, a Zionist colonial settler state, ? And suffice it to say, the question mark was superfluous. And everything was just sort of driving toward I felt the political view of the professor that was teaching the course, whereas, in contrast, the philosophy course that I was describing to you, or even I'm thinking about an intellectual history class that I took, I didn't really know what my professor thought. And we were always obsessed with, like, what do they really think? And that made it, it just felt like they were trying to, as much as possible, remove their own views to teach texts and ideas to us in the most capacious way possible. Now, it turns out with the intellectual history course, that professor is now on Twitter, and I see what he thinks. And it's very much, not my view of the world, but I really admire the fact that I didn't know that when I took his class, and that I was able to sort of come to my own positions without feeling like if I wasn't parroting what he said, that I would somehow be punished. Whether it was, in the grade that I received or in the seminar section part of the lecture course. So to me, that's a really important distinction.
Okay, so there's a couple of things there that I think might be worth highlighting, or they strike me as worth highlighting anyways. Is I wrote a chapter in my last book, which is Beyond Order, called Abandon Ideology. And one of the propositions that makes up the argument in that chapter is that you have to beware of unifactorial explanations for complex phenomena. Is that if you look at anything, perhaps you might look at the wage gap, say, between men and women, the purported wage gap. Well, the probability that there's one
Exactly.
reason that that occurs? Well, first of all, you have to ask the question to begin with, is the gap real? There's a measurement issue there. And so you can take that apart because you don't have to accept the proposition that the phenomena even exists to begin with. That happens in psychology all the time, where people will use a term in common parlance, but not necessarily be able to translate that into some like objective reality. Like, for example, we experience an emotion, the emotion of shame, but it isn't obvious that there's a shame system neurobiologically. Maybe it's the interaction of a variety of neurobiological systems, whereas for anxiety, there looks like there's a neurobiological system, and for play, there's a neurobiological system. And so there's not necessarily a one-to-one correspondence between a word and the objective world. So you can always question that. But then when you look at a complicated phenomena, the probability that there's multiple reasons for its existence, or even if there isn't, that there's multiple theories about the single thing that's the cause of its existence, that's a necessary part of sophisticated thinking. And so maybe one thing for people to beware of is a totalizing viewpoint. All of this plethora of complexity is a consequence of this one thing. And that's the hallmark, that's one of the hallmarks, perhaps one of the hallmarks of propaganda, when it's not utilizing just outright deceit. And so, and then I think there's another something that you pointed to more implicitly, which is that maybe it's also necessary to cast an extraordinarily skeptical eye on totalizing theories that identify a convenient enemy. And a convenient enemy would be someone that you're clearly not. Because it's, and so I've become very leery of conversations, for example, where people rely on the word they. And I don't mean that as a gender neutral pronoun. I mean, when you talk about the they that are at fault when they're doing the things they're doing, you think, well, it's kind of convenient that that doesn't include you, because a lot of the really complex problems that we face are all our problems and all our doing in some sense, in some broad sense, or at least all our responsibility. So there's the totalizing element, there's the and it's so psychologically rewarding also to do, in some sense, to develop a totalizing theory that means that you have an explanation for absolutely everything, because with minimal cognitive effort, you have a map of the entire world.
And it means you have a community. I mean, I don't think we can overstate how comforting it is to feel like you're part of a tribe and that you're aligned against those people over there.
Yeah, well, the first part of that might be beneficial and positive, but the second part, which tends to go along with it, is the danger of that communal drive. You know, there is evidence, for example, that people who are high in empathy are much harsher in their outgroup evaluations than people who are low in empathy. Because, you know, we think of empathy as an untrammeled good. Well, it unites people, and it unites them with love, essentially. It's biologically speaking, it's a manifestation of the affiliative circuit that bonds mother and child, and that's elaborated up into pair bonding for adult humans, but then it extends out to those who are your kin. That all sounds lovely and positive, but you know, you don't want to get between a mother grizzly and her cubs. So there's that side of it. So the distinction between the propaganda, let's say, and a real exploration or a real class, or a real education, I think hinges on something like exploration. So let's think about these podcasts as an example. I mean, I find a podcast discussion particularly useful when the two people who are involved in the discussion are exploring at the fringes of their knowledge and trying to further what they already know, instead of trying to hammer home a point to convince the person they're talking to or themselves or the listener. And in my classes, you know, when they were going well, I stepped through a variety of psychological theories in my personality class, right? So started with Freud and Jung and Adler and Rogers and all the great clinicians. And I would put forward their case as strongly as possible and trying to explore what they meant. But that wasn't my viewpoint. It was an attempt to explore, and then I could pull the students along with it. And that seems to be much different than here's the problem, here's the perpetrators, it's a soul. And you experienced, like, there was a phenomenological experience that you had that made you contrast those two approaches.
Yeah, and it was also, I mean, this connects it back to your initial question, which is what the hell happened at the New York Times. in a way, that answer to that begins in college, because that was the first time that I started to encounter what has been called critical social justice or critical race theory or wokeness, or what Rod Dreher's called soft totalitarianism, or really cultural and moral relativism, to put it more simply. I remember very, very clearly getting into an argument with another friend, also identified as a feminist, and she was justifying female genital mutilation to me because that's other people's culture and we need to respect it. I'm being crude, but that was the basic argument. And I remember thinking, what the hell? How can you possibly call yourself a feminist and believe in defending the rights of women and believe that women should be safe and have equality of opportunity to men, and also believe that female genital mutilation can be justified in any universe? And so it was the first time, and it was very uncomfortable, but in a way I'm grateful for it, because the ideas that I started to encounter, both in classes and also socially at school, those are the ideas that have now swallowed the culture and have swallowed the institutions that are meant to uphold the liberal order.